Good afternoon, my name is Brittany Orlando, and this is my presentation on U.S.-Iran nuclear agreements. In the first slide, I provide a brief overview of this presentation. This presentation will cover a brief history of U.S.-Iran relations, cultural and diplomatic differences, a brief history of Iranian nuclear program, the nuclear agreements and international reactions and viewpoints to these agreements, and I will close with recommendations and conclusion. My thesis statement for this project is that U.S.-Iran relations have been antagonistic for decades due to disputes over nuclear proliferation and Iranian sponsorship of terrorism. Escalating military tensions and core ideological differences have led to numerous diplomatic challenges. So here I provide a brief history of U.S.-Iran relations. U.S. relations with Iran began in the 19th century and were friendly and cooperative. Iran was in search of an ally against British and Russian colonial interests. This period was known as the Great Game, where the British and Russian empires competed for territory in Western and Central Asia. The United States, by contrast, seemed to be a more trustworthy foreign power with little economic interest in the region. This relationship between the United States and Iran flourished at the onset of the Cold War under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's rule. Before Reza Pahlavi took power, the previous leader of Iran, President Mohammad Mossadegh, was not as comfortable with Iranian and American relations and believed that the West was looking to monopolize on Iran's oil production. But when the Shah came to power, all of that changed. In 1979, we had the Iranian Revolution, which changed the United States and Iranian relations permanently. And the two nations have not had a formal diplomatic relationship since the year 1980. Iran's nuclear program is of particular concern to the United States and its Western allies. Intelligence collected in the region for decades has indicated that Tehran might attempt to develop nuclear weapons. In early 2025, the American presidential administration took action to impose maximum pressure on Iran to abandon its nuclear program and support for terrorist organizations. In February 2025, President Donald Trump signed the National Security Presidential Memorandum 2, which instructs U.S. officials to impose this maximum pressure on Iran to persuade it to abandon its nuclear program and support for terrorist organizations. NSPM 2 allows for the imposition of sanctions and legal action against Iran if they do not comply with the United States' demand. In summer of this year, airstrikes by Israel and the United States targeted key nuclear sites, Isfahan, Natanz, and Fordow, and the extent of the damage remains unknown. So in this slide, I'm going to discuss a little bit about U.S.-Iran cultural and diplomatic differences. Cultural and religious differences are a roadblock to developing anti-proliferation policies and doctrine. In Iran, religious authorities are given the highest priority over political and legislative decision-making. This dynamic can restrict operational autonomy, as leaders must navigate the expectations and directions of religious figures. Iran's axis of resistance compounds this issue and provides additional support in countering the influence of the United States and Israel in the region. Iran has explicitly expressed support for revolutions and militias across the MENA region. They have participated in protests and other violent revolutions in countries such as Iraq, Bahrain, Lebanon, Yemen, Palestine. Tehran believes that uranium enrichment is a sovereign right, which means that they are allowed to, do what they please when it comes to nuclear energy, as their right as a free country. They refuse to halt enrichment, even though the U.S. demands zero enrichment from them. Tehran also refuses to comply with IAEA regulations for peaceful nuclear energy and cannot demonstrate that it's not being used for military purposes, i.e., nuclear weapons. The International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the United Nations watchdog for peaceful nuclear energy, has reported that Iran has failed to cooperate with UN inspectors. They have also stated that Tehran has been unable to explain and demonstrate that its nuclear material is not being diverted for further enrichment or for military use. The following day, after this inspection, Israel conducted a series of airstrikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, targeting key sites tied to the country's military operations. And several days later, the United States also conducted similar strikes on Isfahan, Natanz, and Fordow enrichment facilities. The extent of the damage at the time of this writing remains unknown, as well as the long-term policy implications of these recent airstrikes and what that might hold for future diplomatic relations. So here I provide a brief timeline of the Iranian nuclear program. Some key years and dates have been provided here. The first known important date in this timeline is 1957, where the US and Iran signed the first civil nuclear cooperation agreement. This was part of the Atoms for Peace program. In 1979, during the Iranian Revolution, the new leadership in power froze the existing nuclear program as the country was going through several political and religious changes. In 1982, Iranian officials announced that they planned to build a reactor powered by their own uranium at the Isfahan Nuclear Technology Center, a center that is still fairly active up until today. In 2002, we received the first accusations from the United States against Iran to attempt to make nuclear weapons and fail to comply with UN regulations. In 2010, a computer worm known as Stuxnet infects the Natanz enrichment site and destroyed about 1,000 centrifuges, which set back Iran's nuclear program for quite a long time. In 2015, the Iran deal, also known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, was signed, and this deal called for greater monitoring of Iranian nuclear sites and pushed for further compliance with UN regulations against nuclear energy. In early 2025, discussions began for a new nuclear deal with Iran, with the United States calling for zero enrichments of uranium. And as mentioned in the previous slide, in June of 2025, Israel and the United States conducted airstrikes upon the three key nuclear enrichment facilities. International responses to Iran's nuclear program have been varied based on the regions. These views vary greatly due to several geopolitical and economic factors. Israel in particular categorizes the program as an existential threat to the country and that all options for deterrence must be considered. In 2007, at the annual G8 conference, 5 members of the UN Security Council agreed to pass a new resolution to impose tougher sanctions on Iran. In 2009, Amir Moussa, who's the chief of the Arab League, states that Israel's nuclear program is more of a threat than Iran's, but diplomatic cables in 2010 revealed that some Persian Gulf officials do support a military attack against Iran. In 2010, Japan imposes banking and investment sanctions on Iran, particularly energy-related investments, because of the nuclear program. In 2012, the European Union agrees to enforce an oil embargo on Iran because of the nuclear program. India is not a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is one of the earliest nuclear treaties in the modern age. But they have voted against Iran in the past to clear the way for the Iranian deal. So generally speaking, many experts believe that India could be an ally. in deterring Iran's nuclear program, but this is, just speculatory. And Pakistan has chosen to remain neutral. However, on the other hand, not everyone is against the Iranian nuclear program. Officials in Iraq, Algeria, and Indonesia have all expressed support for Iran's right for peaceful nuclear energy production, believing that it is Iran's sovereign right to do so. In conclusion, diplomatic challenges between the U.S. and Iran remain as burdensome as ever. There are several roadblocks to intelligence collection and conflict resolution, and they're compounded by the axis of resistance, which is Iran's support for terrorist organizations in the Levant and the MENA region and West Asia. Cultural and religious differences continue to persist, especially in policy development. The 2020 assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, who was the key architect in the strategies used in the axis of resistance and in their accompanying revolutions, was assassinated by U.S. forces. This event only exacerbated tensions between the two countries. Iran's refusal to comply with UN nuclear requirements adds an additional layer of distrust and apprehension. And the outcome of the 2025 new nuclear agreement with Iran could have lasting effects on American foreign